Okay, welcome everybody. I would like to welcome you on behalf of the Center for American Studies and Research, CASR, at this event entitled Football or Soccer, What's in a Word, with Professor Stefan Szymanski. Professor Szymanski is a professor of sport management at the University of Michigan, a public research university, but he's not American. He is born and raised in England, although some people ask me where is the name Szymanski coming from. I ask him myself, it's coming from his Polish dad. And he grew up in England, and he has a BA in politics from the University of Oxford, and his master and PhD are from the University of London, although his PhD was not on sports, it was entitled Essays on Economic Architecture. Professor Szymanski had, before joining the University of Michigan in 2011, other academic appointments at the City University London, at Imperial College London, and the London Business School. And many of you know, and some were already asking him to sign the book, his best-selling book, Soccernomics, although the full title of the book is Soccernomics, Why England Loses, Why Germany, Spain and France Win, and Why One Day Japan, Iraq and the United States will become kings of the world's most popular sport. With 31 words, I believe it's the best-selling book with the longest title. And it was translated into 18 languages and sold more than 300,000 times, which is really remarkable for an academic book. And today, Professor Szymanski will talk about another recent publication, which is entitled, as a title of today's talk. I would finally mention that Professor Szymanski took the preparation of today's talk very serious by skiing and swimming yesterday after his arrival on late Saturday night. It's one of Lebanon's marketing claims that it's a country where you can do skiing and swimming at the same day. And as a professor of sport management, you tested it, and it was really possible, right? So please join me in welcoming Professor Szymanski.
Well, thank you, Professor Reagan, for that very generous introduction. And only one small correction. I was raised in London, but actually I was born in Lagos, Nigeria.
Oh.
So don't let anybody tell you globalization is a new thing. But I am delighted to be here, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. And as you explained, I fulfilled a lifelong ambition. I think I read about this idea that you could ski in the morning and swim in the afternoon, I think 35 years ago, and it always stuck in my mind. I would love to do that one day, and so yesterday was the day. So this trip has made me
Swim on the beach?
Yeah, I swam down there. You might several people have said that might have been a mistake, but
No, it's not 16 degrees.
But it was a great experience, and the skiing was wonderful. But I'm very pleased to give you this talk today, which is based on a book that I published with Professor Silke Weineck, who's a colleague, a professor of comparative literature at the University of Michigan. We published this book last year, and it never fails to strike controversy, and I think I can start off with my first slide, which really in some ways can summarize the whole issue. If I can make it. There we go.
It ends in a tie. It ends in a tie. We get that in soccer sometimes. Don't we get ties?
It's football, no soccer.
Oh, excuse me. Okay, they're insulting our company.
Okay, there you go. So that's Sergio Aguero, an Argentine who happens to work in England currently, explaining to an American that it's football, not soccer. Why an Argentine who speaks Spanish would be invested in this particular debate between British English and American English is an interesting question, and really what a question that I want us to focus on. The cover of the book that published On the left you have the hardcover, on the right you have the Kindle edition, just so that you know, in case you're interested. And it's a relatively short book, and we really wanted to go into this issue of how this naming question of a game could become so important in people's lives. And again, let me give you another example of how seriously people take this issue. So this was the, as I'm sure you know, this is the, on the left is the advertisement for my talk, describing what I was talking about and so on, and this was then tweeted out by the American University in Beirut, and immediately a reply comes. You can see this reply, something about the World Series, but then it will always be football to me, but I'm not going to argue about it. So again, immediately you say this, it becomes an issue for somebody to talk about this. And that was a relatively gentle comment. And if you go onto the internet and try typing the phrase, "It's football, not soccer," it's a great phrase to try out. I recommend you do it. You come up with the most amazing collection of comments. So this is just a very small selection. So the one at the top, it seems that almost every American can't understand that there is no sport called soccer. It's football. And in case you think this is just a British obsession, although the Aguero comment should alert you to the fact that it's not, look at the comment from, I've blanked out names and sites to be polite to people, but this is a comment from a Chinese guy talking about Real Madrid and Manchester United fan. I have no idea why the Americans and the Australians call football soccer. Which is completely different, and there's nowhere near a football game. Soccer is not the terminology. It's not the British who call it. I learned sports in China. It is called football. In China. And then the one at the bottom, well, I'm not going to, I had to blank out some more than just the address there, but again, people get very heated about this. They say things, they are reduced to foul language when it comes to talking about it. And of course the other internet phenomenon that we all know is when people start typing in all caps. That's the internet equivalent of screaming, of course. Don't they know the real name football? Again, a very extraordinary and extreme level of investment in the name of this game. So, let's start off by going over a little bit of the history of the name of this game and its name, and how it came to have this name. So, if you're a football, or dare I say it, soccer fan, you probably know some of this. The game that we play or that we watch today, most of the world is clearly the world's most popular sport today, was essentially founded in the Freemasons' Tavern in London on the 26th of October 1863, which was the first meeting of the Football Association, a name that they gave to themselves. And you can see here the pictures are copies of the minutes and notes taken at those meetings. There were a further 6 meetings that took place up until December, and by that time, by December 1863, the Football Association had agreed a set of rules, and these rules are essentially the same as the rules to which we play today. There have been a few changes, so some things are different, some things, a couple of major differences actually, but broadly speaking, it's recognisably the game that we play today. Now, let me be clear. Throughout all history, people have done things with balls. They have kicked balls, thrown balls, hit balls with sticks, and no nation or people can claim to be the originators of playing around with balls. That must clearly be something that's kind of universal. And we know that there are many ball games that existed. The Greeks had ball games, the Romans had ball games, People say the Egyptians had ball games. The Chinese certainly had a game called kickball, which is actually very well documented going back to the Middle Ages and beyond. We know that the Aztecs played some kind of a ball game, so ball games in general are extremely common in all civilizations and places. But the specific game that we think about as football, association football, it can be traced back to these origins in London in 1863. They called it football, but bear in mind that when they were founding this, they weren't really thinking too hard about what they were going to call it. Football was also something that we think had been played in England for roughly 1,000 years or so. There are various claims to the original reference. There's actually a reference to a ball game in a 9th century history of Britain written by Nennius, a monk. There's another text in Latin in 1174 that's thought to refer to football, although it's not entirely clear. And the first mention of the word in English football appears sometime at the end of the 14th century, so at least 500 years before the founding of the Football Association, this word had been used. And one of the things that we have a chapter in the book about this, one of the things about those games is there was an almost infinite variety of football in England. It was played in many different ways, and how it was played seemed to vary from place to place. Almost if you could go from one village to the next village, you'd find a different version of the game. Nobody was very concerned about writing down rules, and so they were very disorganized and very unstructured. And what the Football Association was doing was bringing structure to this. And one of the first things they found is that some people didn't like the rules that they had laid down. And particularly, a couple of clubs who were party to the first meeting, the Blackheath clubs, decided that they didn't want to play the version of the game that would, as described in the rules written down by the Football Association. And oddly, the reason for the disagreement is not the one that most people usually think. The Blackheath clubs eventually went on to found the game of rugby, and that rugby union, the first version of the game, which then morphed in, also developed another version called Rugby League in 1895. And it wasn't that they wanted to handle the ball, that wasn't the issue. The issue was the rugby people wanted to be able to be free to kick the shins of their opponents without this being against the rules. And the Football Association majority quite sensibly said that's a stupid rule, we're definitely going to ban that. And oddly enough, the Blackheath clubs walked out at this stage and didn't join that. Although, of course, eventually, the rugby people also decided that that was a pretty stupid idea as well, so that became illegal. And the difference became the handling of the ball. But that came later. In any case, in 1863, they didn't have a specific name, they just generically called it football. But by the 1870s, when the rugby version of the game had been codified by Blackheath and other clubs, then there becomes a problem of how to differentiate these two versions of football. They both called their games football. The rugby people had no trouble naming it. Their version was based on the game played at rugby school in the Midlands of England, so they would clearly call it rugby football. But what were the Football Association people going to call it? With great imagination, they went from Football Association to calling the game Association Football. So that's the proper name of the game, and that's how to read it. So I was thinking a little bit about how popular this game is here, where we are today, of course, in Lebanon. It seems like there's some disagreement over this. So the top quote says, basketball's moderately popular, but football's more popular. Wikipedia sits firmly on the fence. Football is one of the most popular sports in Lebanon. Basketball is one of the most popular sports in Lebanon. Fair enough. But actually at the bottom there's some suggestion that maybe football is falling behind basketball and maybe basketball is taking over. I'm not going to make a decision on this. But
If you want me as a spokesperson of the
Still,
Lebanese Football Association.
Football is still the first population in Lebanon.
First, according to number of players.
Players and spectators. Spectators, you know. Like Nijmi, I had more than 20,000 people can attend. And the biggest
For big matches,
stadium in Lebanon concerning basketball, 7,000 to 8,000 people.
Even in terms of budget.
Concerning budget, concerning TV rights, before it was the number one basketball, because the Lebanese team qualified 3 times for the World Championship and will have a big budget at the clubs. But in general, more people can practice football more than in basketball.
So most viewed, also you mean on TV also, how many people watch football? This is also important to know. Because I mean, when we talk about popularity, in my opinion, we need to see how many people practice the sport, registered and non-registered. This is important.
Yes.
And most viewed is not only, I think, in the stadium, is on TV. And when we talk about the most viewed sport, we need to see, is it the local product or the international? I mean, I'm sure if we add the Champions League, I mean, all the football product on television, football will beat basketball for sure.
I mean the national football.
The local product.
Football, but concerning as product TV right and TV as how can I can say as an industry is the basketball in Lebanon.
Yes.
So I think Professor Ragan needs to get a student working on this to actually put the numbers together and establish.
But I think the discussion shows that it depends, of course, on the indicators, on participation, spectatorship, success, and
Success.
TV rights. But as a complete outsider, I would, because I always thought that probably basketball is more popular because it's probably advanced a bit internationally on a Lebanese scale. Obviously, the nature of the football fields would house more players than basketball. So, you know, we can't take the numbers of 20,000 in a football field because even when you look internationally, you know, basketball courts are smaller than football. But I was under the impression that because the popularity of the Lebanese basketball league maybe since the late 90s into the turn of the century has advanced further.
2 decades, yes.
It became a popular game, you know, and
Plus
possibly
the TV rights and
plus the TV rights as well, it's highly watched. If we say what the gentleman said, if we just look at the popularity of one game over the other, I would say that of course football is more because we tend to have, as you may have noticed from our discussion earlier, we support globally. You know, you just have to come to Lebanon during the World Cup and you see how crazy the country is over here on the world. So the popularity of a game is definitely football. Personally, I still believe that maybe basketball on a
local
product.
Local basketball product. I mean, the Lebanese basketball league, the Lebanese football league. Maybe I'm not 100% sure, but I think basketball league is ahead.
But I think
as a TV, not
TV,
as
TV.
a TV.
Yeah.
As how, a way of the football, you know, that no mention concerning the World Cup occasion, how can the cafes or the restaurants, a lot of people are interested. Yes.
Well, so there are a number of interesting points there, but in the end, it probably doesn't matter. It's like asking, is one pop star more popular than another? If they're selling a lot of records, then that's fine. Clearly, though, I mean, we could all agree football is a very, very popular
It's
sport. Right up there at the top. So what do you call it? Well, as I understand it, the name in Lebanon for this game in Arabic is Kurat al-Qadam, ball of the foot. Good, I'm glad I got that right. Actually, we didn't rely on our own research to do it. We asked, we have a professor at Michigan called Anton Szymanski. He's a poet of Lebanese Palestinian origin, and so we asked him. But you never know with poets whether you could trust him. He told us that this was the right. So as I understand it, Kura means ball, but of course many people just say football, or they say football. My very poor French accent. And of course, it may well be that football, the name football, is not really the English name. It may actually really be the French word football. The reason being, of course, that the world governing body is FIFA, the Fédération Internationale Football Association, and that's the football that people use, that's the word that people use to call the name. Now, of course, the French got the word from the English, but then the French would say, well, since you got all your words from us in the first place anyway. So, in some sense, there's the linguistic origins of this start to get complicated. And it is, and while the Lebanese case is quite typical, that either the word football is directly taken as a loan word, or the local words for ball and foot are combined to give the name to the game. That is by no means true everywhere. Let me give you some examples. Famously, in Italy, they call it calcio, which has nothing to do with foot or ball, but it's actually the name of a medieval game they played in Italy, which they falsely claim was the origin of football, which we, of course, already discovered was in London, actually took place in London. In the region of Naples, they have another name still, Opalone. So there can be regional variations even within a given country. In Croatia and Slovenia, they call the game nogomet. Nogomet means leg sweep, so essentially the movement of the leg in kicking the ball. So the ball itself is not mentioned in the name that they've given to the game. And then there are all these other countries where they have different names, which you can see here. Malaysia and Indonesia are interesting because they have this name Sepak Bola or Bola Sepak, which has to do with, an original, an earlier game that was played in these countries. I could go on. There are many other examples. A lot of countries have a name for the game which really relates to, it's just the word ball. It's as in just the ball on its own, which you can kick, and you can see this across many of the African names. I really could go on and on here. This is very. There are lots of names. In Vietnam, it's called Bong Da. Bong Da means kick ball. So not football, but kickball. And indeed, for some strange reason, that's also the name in Papua New Guinea. Again, words like Pila in Malawi and Ebola in Swaziland seem to be just ball. And I'm not done. There are a number. There's Ebola comes up again. There are some much more complicated ones. Samoan Lakapi, Namibian Kukumpadi. So clearly football is not the only name that you can use to describe this game. It has many names around the world. It's fair to say that football or some local variant of it is the most common, but it's by no means universal. And I don't think anybody gets very upset about what Namibians call the name of the game that we love. And of course, as you know, there are many other footballs to consider as well. We've already mentioned rugby football and its two variants, rugby union and rugby league. There's Gaelic football, which is incredibly popular in Ireland.
We have an Irish faculty member attending.
Very good. I'm going to tell us much about the play of Gaelic football and the GAA and all its social significance of Gaelic football. There's Australian rules football, which again is a completely different game from any of those described. And finally, of course, American football, which is really in some ways my subject, but it's just one variant of the game of football. And where these games are played, people refer to these games as football. Even in parts of the UK where the association game is the most popular game, there are parts of the country where rugby union and rugby league are more popular, and in those parts of the country, the game that they play there locally, rugby union or rugby league, will be referred to as football, not the association football game. So in these cases where the most popular game is not association football, what name should you use for the game? To call it football, to call association football, when you have another football which you call football, is going to be problematic. So here's an idea. Why don't you take a word that comes from the people who invented the game of association football and use their word? That would be a good word to do. Good thing to do. So here is a cutting from a newspaper in Adelaide in Australia from 1899, which tells you something about a new word, soccer. Who now speaks of association or rugby football, and who does not welcome the abbreviated forms of soccer and rugger? On whose lips association first changed into soccer, history is silent. It would be interesting to know whether the verb to sock, meaning to kick violently, to jump upon or give beats to, was itself a further derivative of soccer, or has a totally different origin of its own. Soccer, however, is an excellent example of Oxford minting, whether or not she can claim the credit of its invention. So in Australia in 1899, it was already understood that soccer was a word that had been invented in Oxford University in England. And if that doesn't convince you, here is a letter to the New York Times from 1905. This letter is interesting because actually the view of this individual is that this is a very bad word, which is a common view today, that soccer is a very bad word. In fact, this person's view, again, in common with many, is to say, in the first place, there is no such word, which is a peculiar thing to write a letter about a word that doesn't exist. But where does this letter to the New York Times, how does this letter explain the origin of the word soccer? It says, as a matter of fact, it was a fad at Oxford and Cambridge to use ER at the end of words such as footer, sporter, and as association did not take an ER easily, it was and is sometimes spoken of as soccer. And this name was then was spread to the United States through the visits of English teams using the word soccer. And the one thing about this is this guy, Francis Tabor, he's almost certainly an Englishman. He appears as, in another document, as the secretary of an exclusive club in New York for English expatriates living there. And to be secretary of that club, he would almost certainly have had to have been an Englishman. So this is one Englishman really saying that he doesn't like the word that other Englishmen have invented, even to the point of denying this word. So if we have to ask where the word soccer comes from, it's very clearly a word of English, British origin. In fact, we know very clearly it comes from Oxford University, Oxford or Cambridge, in the period of the late 19th century. And indeed, it emerges very quickly. The first known reference to the word is about 1894. And bear in mind that the name association football doesn't really appear until the 1870s, so it appears really very early on in the history of the game. And the word soccer has been used over and over again since it was coined at the end of the 19th century. And as far as I know, none of these examples upset anybody. So New Zealand has long called it soccer. There's been an issue today about whether they continue to call it soccer, but there's an example of a poster for a New Zealand soccer national club championship. Geelong in Australia has a soccer and sports club. Again, soccer is widely used in Australia. Why wouldn't they? Again, rugby union is the most popular sport in New Zealand. Rugby league and rugby league is the most popular rugby version of Australian rules. Those are more popular in Australia, and therefore soccer was a natural word for them to use. Batswood Soccer Club, founded in 1929, is a South African soccer club. Again, they use the word soccer because historically rugby union has been more popular in South Africa. And then the last one, I think Canadian Soccer Club is a glorious example. This is the name of a team quite recently set up, would you believe, in Uruguay. In Uruguay for Canadians, for Uruguayan Canadians. I don't know quite how this works. You'd have thought it would have to be in Canada, but it's not, it's in Uruguay. Anyway, they've adopted the name Canadian Soccer Club. So it's clear that this is a name that can be used in lots of situations, even though clearly in Uruguay, football is the most, association football is the most popular sport, whereas in Canada, of course, it's not. So it's only when Americans use this word that we get the outpourings of distress and horror. One of the most popular taunts that people throw at this is to say that American football is not really football, it should be called hand egg, because you use a hand and it's shaped like an egg. Hand egg. Very funny. So there's no short humor, and I guess it's better to try to be funny than it is to be abusive, as people often are. And really quite clever, funny people sink into this kind of abuse. So if you go onto the web, there's a really unfunny, very long piece by John Cleese, of all people. He's probably one of the funniest Englishmen in history, who spent an entire career delighting in the absurdity of language and the double meanings of language, the way that things don't necessarily mean what they appear to. And this dirge-like diatribe is just about how they should call it hand egg. Well, obviously he knows that that languages don't work like that. And yet, even someone with such an acute sense of humour as him falls into this kind of crazy, abusive position. It's very strange, and it's clearly a response to Americans. Now, I want to say this very clearly to begin with. I think this is stupid. I think it's stupid because, very clearly, the most popular sport in the United States has been called football since the 1870s. Now, there's no way they're changing the name of that game now. They're not going to suddenly say, oh, the rest of the world thinks that football is association football, so we'll adopt that name. You've got to be kidding. Nobody else would do that. Nobody else who's been doing something for the best part of 150 years is suddenly going to change the name. So it's silly to even suggest it. Association football, although it's growing in popularity in the United States, it's still way less popular than any major league sport. It's much less popular than football, it's less popular than basketball, it's less popular than baseball, it's less popular than hockey, and therefore really there's no chance. It will be a long, long time before soccer would be ever to rank with the major league sports in the United States.
Even the World Cup, or just the local product of it? I mean, if we take all the...
I'm talking about in the United States.
Okay,
I'm only talking about amongst Americans,
okay.
People living in the United States. It's clearly not the most popular sport in the world. Is clearly association football. That clearly has the biggest audiences. Its position as number one is not in doubt. What is very clear is though it's number 5 in the United States.
Yes.
Like if we add the Champions League on TV and the World Cup, would it be ahead of hockey or still be behind?
No.
Okay.
No. So the Champions League is shown midweek afternoons in the United States. Everybody's at work. I mean, I watch it, but no. I mean, there are lots of expatriates who watch it, so you can get fairly significant audiences. But if you get an audience of 1 million TV viewers in the United States, that's sort of like the biggest audience that you will get.
So you're not teaching Tuesday, Wednesday afternoons.
Right. Well, maybe I am, but I'm skipping parts.
Okay.
We won't go into that. They're recording this, right? So
Yes.
we get more into it. That's 1% of US TV viewing audiences, so it's tiny. Now it is true that 1 or 2 World Cup games have attracted big audiences, but again, you set that against the 100 million people who watch the Super Bowl. Association football is not even close. So they're right to have a different name. It's a very sensible thing. They've got a very popular game which is hugely successful and has been there forever. They need another good name for association football. So what did they choose for this other name? They chose a name that came from the home of association football. They chose the word soccer, which comes from Oxford. How sensible is that? So to say that they shouldn't do this, they shouldn't use this word, it's just insane. And clearly there's something more to this issue than simply, you know, the question about what we're going to call it. There's more at stake here. And there's something even stranger about this issue about what we call this game. So, I'm of an age where I grew up in England in the 1960s and 70s. And I remember as a small boy, everybody or most boys in my age, of my era, at Christmas, one present you would get would be a book about association football. It would be full of stories of the local players. It would be all about English teams, and then it was before people really thought too much about international football. And these books were called annuals, and you would get one in your stockroom. That would be a big present for that Christmas Day. And these annuals were called soccer annuals. And one thing is, when I started to think about this issue, I said, I could swear that this was a common word used in England back in the day. And indeed, if we look at the record, indeed it was. So this is just a selection of books on association football published in the UK from the 1920s up until the end of the 1970s, actually up until the 1980s. On the right-hand side, you can see some of these, those are lists of some of these kind of books, so I guess I would have got, so the sorts of ones I would have got would have been sort of George Best's soccer album, that would have been the sort of one I might have got. But you can see all these other ones that were books aimed at children, clearly using the word soccer, not football. And then all these other books about teaching are all about teaching the game, coaching, how again it was before the FA didn't remove its ban on women playing football until 1971, I think it was, and so there's soccer for boys, there was no soccer for girls, soccer for schoolboys, soccer the modern way, teaching soccer to boys, teach yourself soccer. These are all books published in England aimed at an English audience, not aimed at an American audience, aimed at an English audience, a British audience. And so it clearly was, back in the day, an acceptable word. I was at Old Trafford taking a group of Michigan students on a stadium tour last week, and they had educational guides, and our guide introduced herself, and one of the first things she said, knowing it was an American group, well, welcome, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how soccer's been played in this stadium, only I can't call it soccer, I can't use the word, it's got to be football. So, being a difficult kind of person, I put my hand up and you said, you've heard of Sir Matt Busby? And of course she said, of course you knew who Matt Busby, Sir Matt Busby was. He was legendary coach of Manchester United from 1945 to 1973. Led the team, survived the Munich air disaster, many championships, won the first European Championship United, a legend of association football. What was his autobiography called, I asked her. She said, I don't know. Well, his autobiography was called My Life in Soccer, published in about 1970. So if it's good enough for Sir Matt Busby to use the word soccer, surely it's an okay word to use. Surely there's not a problem using the word soccer. So at this point, I got interested in thinking about, is there something here I can prove about with data? Because I'm actually an economist, I'm not really a cultural sociologist or anything like that. So I was thinking, can I prove anything with numbers about what's been happening here? Because I thought something strange was going on. So I started finding out how they do this properly in linguistics, and there's a field called corpus linguistics where you try to get a common source, and then you use statistics to analyze how changes occur in the use of language. So I wanted to do something fairly simple, which is look at the frequency with which the words football and soccer have been used in two different sources, the Times of London and the New York Times. And I guess you can see already my hypothesis. My hypothesis is that as the word soccer rose in popularity in the United States, because soccer has become a more popular game in the United States, it would decline in the Times of London. So here's some data. So this is the frequency of the word soccer as it appears in the New York Times. So this is as a share of the total appearances of the words football and soccer. So bear in mind that football would mostly appear in the New York Times in the context of what we would call American football, and soccer would, and rarely would that apply. They would not use the word football to describe association football. They would use the word soccer. And you already see something very strange. You see a very big spike in 1913, 1914, where actually, and if this is a share, the word soccer appeared in the New York Times more frequently than the word football. Just before the First World War began, there was actually a huge surge of interest in the game in the United States. And it's actually possible that had it not been for the First World War, association football could have become the dominant sport in the United States in the 20th century. Many of the players that were coming to play when they were popularizing the game in the United States at that point were actually coming from Europe. There was a big push from clubs in Europe to try and make it popular with Americans, and it was having some success. But of course, the start of the First World War put an end to all of that. And then you can see a fairly steady rise. You can see, and there's sort of two things to notice in there. You can see a peak around 1980, and that's to do with something called the North American Soccer League, the NASL. So in the 1970s, many of the world's greatest stars went to play in the NASL in the United States. Of course, the great Pele played there for New York Cosmos, and Franz Beckenbauer, the legendary German captain, Bobby Moore, the captain of the England 1966 World Cup winning team, Georgie Best, Johan Cruyff. Many of the world's greatest players played in the United States during this period, and it did generate a surge of interest in the United States. And that's probably one moment at which not only does the word soccer start to get more frequently used, but people outside of the United States start to notice that that's what the Americans call the game. They're calling it soccer and not football. Because all of the big stars from Europe in particular are moving across, people in Europe start to notice that the word soccer is being used. The second spike there, which you can see, so after the NASL collapses in 1984, and you can see a decline in the word soccer, there was no professional league in the US between 1994 and between 1984 and 1996, when Major League Soccer is launched. But you can see there in the early 90s there's a big spike, and of course that's the 1994 World Cup, which is hosted by the United States, which triggered a revival in the game and has a revival which has continued pretty much to the present day. So now let's look at the comparison with what happened in England. So the comparison, this statistic is slightly different. So one thing, of course, when the World Cup is played in the US in 1994, there are an awful lot of mentions in British newspapers about the fact that Americans call it soccer, and I took those references out, took references in an American context out, because that's clearly kind of cheating. I'm interested in the British referring to soccer in its own right as a legitimate term for the game. The other thing, so likewise, if there's a mention of Major League Soccer, that's the name of the American League, I took that out. I don't count that as a reference to soccer because that's not the British using it in a British context, it's referring to something foreign. And the other thing we did is in the denominator, we took out references to football which were preceded by the word rugby, because clearly that's not referring to association football. So this is intended to reflect the share of references of soccer to the combined references to football and soccer in the context of association football as played in the UK. And what you can see here is a very clear picture. In fact, before the Second World War, it doesn't rate mentions very often at all. Actually, it barely appears as a word in the Times of London. But from the 1950s onwards, it rises in popularity very rapidly. And it goes from something like 1 to 2% of mentions each year in terms of its share of references to the game, to over 10% by the 1970s. So there's a sharp rise. But since the 1980s, since this point in time in history when everybody starts to notice that the Americans call it soccer, the references in the Times of London start to fall sharply, and have fallen, by 2010, they've fallen to levels that hadn't been seen since 1950. So this is a word that grew in popularity from the 1950s and then collapsed in popularity based on this data sometime around the 1980s. If you want to make a look, red is the New York Times and the blue is the Times of London, and you can see against the steady rise of the Times of London, there's a kind of a rise, initially a rise in the Times of London, and then this decrease in the more recent period. So that seems to me to be reasonably persuasive evidence that there's been, as the word has become more popular in American usage, that's actually triggered, and I want to claim a causal link, that it's leading to a causal link in the decline of the word in British English. And just as another source of evidence, slightly different, there's a very good book called The Football Compendium, published in, actually there are two editions, but the most recent one was published in the mid-2000s. And this is an anthology of a listing of all publications in English referring, in the UK, referring to association football. So it's 600 pages long, it's very large pages, thousands and thousands of entries. And so we counted up year by year, based on publication date, the references to books, titles with the name football in them and soccer in them. And again, we found the same kind of pattern, that there is actually very few books had soccer in the title before the Second World War, but after the Second World War there's this sudden sharp jump of the same kind, to the point where again by the 1960s something like 10% of all books published in the UK about association football actually have soccer in the title, like Sir Matt Busley's autobiography. But then since that peak there's been a steady decline, again presumably reflecting the growing popularity of the term. And again, we're back now to a level which was last seen in the 1950s. And if anything, I would think today the level's even lower as the unpopularity of the word has grown. Now, this is something I think that's very interesting. This means soccer is basically an exile word in British English. And we talked to linguists about this, several, and they can't come up with any other examples. So this is a word that once upon a time was used in common speech and considered an acceptable word to use in reference to a game. And now it's a word which is rejected because other people started to use it. So because Americans started to use it, the British say, no, can't say that word. And go to London and try it out. Stop the first 20 people you find and ask them, is it football or soccer? Pretty much everyone can say, give you an earful and say it's football, it's not soccer. It's a very strange example. So how should we explain it?
As
What-
pronunciation can. A similar thing would be either and either. Once the Americans used either in England, it became either neither instead of neither either. But
Is
its
that right?
pronunciation is not a word.
No, it's not a, and is that well attested that's why that it changed? I mean, I don't
Like
even.
words like schedule and schedule and issue and.
Well, I mean, there are clearly differences in
Yeah,
pronunciation,
Yeah.
but there are differences within England and within Britain in pronunciation.
Well, it came about when George I of Hanover was a German, couldn't pronounce neither either. For him, this was either neither. So once the English, because they invited him to become king, made him pronounce the word, he said either neither. But the Americans still say the correct word, neither neither. But it was redefined in the Oxford Dictionary as being pronounced either neither. And since the Americans used it neither either, they redefined it. That's a story.
Yeah, it's a good
Because
story.
it's
It's
a
a
German
good-
pronunciation of the word neither neither. It's either neither.
But
This EI, you don't say either neither in English, you say neither neither.
I'm not sure what I
I'd say
said.
that depends on the dog. As a linguist, I find that story sketchy.
Yeah, I mean, it's
I've never heard
possible.
that before. But, and I also think, in Ireland anyway, people use them interchangeably, either and either. So I don't
In America too, yeah.
yeah.
I mean,
I'm
whether
just wondering,
could you attest that example with the same level of data as I?
Anyway, it's not, well, this is historically, the way I read it, I would have to look it up, but this is not a word, it's a
Well,
pronunciation anyway.
I would love linguists to get interested in this question.
I'm not
There must be other examples, right? And this can't be the only one. But if it is the only example, then we want credit for finding it. So it's a fascinating, it just is very striking, very, very unusual. So, how are we going to explain it? Well, I think this is just not an argument about what the right name is. It's absurd to think that. This is about culture, and it's about the relationship between the US and the rest of the world. So American culture is clearly dominant in modern society in terms of, obviously in terms of film and Hollywood, music, in terms of, you think of Starbucks, you think of Apple, you think of so many ways in which America is culturally dominant in the world. And this is a way of getting back at the Americans and saying, belittling them for the name that they use for the word. So I don't know if name shaming is a thing, is a term, but I think there ought to be a term, and we are name shaming the Americans for calling it soccer. And interestingly, as my initial quote clip showed of Sergio Aguero, the rest of the world is siding with the Brits on this. For some strange reason, everybody's taking our side. Maybe that's because we just don't matter anymore in this world. But people are joining in on our side and saying to the Americans, even if you're people whose mother tongue is not English, are telling Americans that the right word to use is the British English word, allegedly British English word football, and not the old British English word soccer, which is now claimed to be an American English word, even though it isn't. Now, the relation, as a Brit myself, I find this fascinating. So one thing is, I love this quote from A.J.P. Taylor from 1965. So I always admired him as a historian, and this shows what a kind of prescient man he was. In 1965, Britain still amounted to something, I think. Certainly a lot more than it does today. But he pointed out association football was the most democratic game and almost the most national. By it, the mark of England may well remain in the world when the rest of her influence has vanished. And I think that's dead right. I think he's bang on, and that's true. But I think the Odon Valle quote is also very, very on point as well. So football's the only factor of globalization that's escaped American hegemony. The one of cinema may be dominated by Hollywood, and that of money by Wall Street, but planet football is barely North American at all. And I think, and that's still, that was written actually, I think almost 20 years ago, but I think it's still true, notwithstanding Major League Soccer, notwithstanding the World Cup, it's still essentially a non-American concept. And I think Sir Richard Turnbull said it very well. The British leave behind two monuments. One is association football, and the other is another expression in the English language. But in fact, of course, these two come together in this particular example because we're using the expression to say to the Americans what we think about the word they use for association football. So really, that's what I wanted to say. I think the first thing to say is that I've always found it absurd when people say that sport's not political. It's obviously political in every dimension, and it's also cultural. It's a central feature of our modern cultures. And indeed, one of the problems I would go as far as to argue in humanities in a lot of universities is that sports are neglected. There's often a refusal to engage in what is, for most people, the most significant dimension of culture today, and I think that's to the detriment of the humanities. So I think that understanding this cultural relationship is important. It's obvious that there are multiple football codes, and the football code that you play in your country is what you call football. That's obviously true. And so the claiming that other people cannot or should not use a particular word in their own country for the game that they play, which is not their version of football, it's just hostility. And in this case, it's just anti-Americanism, plain and simple. And I will finish up with not words, well, some words, but really much better a picture. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe you can switch the light on. Yes. I remember before I joined AUB, I was 1 year teaching as a visiting assistant professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. And that year, Germany became handball world champion. And handball is in Germany a major sport. So I was extremely enthusiastic and came the next day to office and told my colleagues, Germany became handball world champion. And they did not know what I'm talking about. They asked me what kind of sport. And in the US, handball is something where you stand in front of a wall and throw a ball against it. So what we call handball, they would call team handball. So I don't know whether this counts as another example, but it gave me a taste of the, sometimes, you might use the same words, but people have different ideas of what they are talking about. Who would like to start to make a contribution to the discussion or ask a question? Arnie Dietrich.
Can you tell us how it migrated to South America? Why it became so popular in South America? You know, historically.
Yeah. So,
can you tell us a bit about it?
So I think it's actually very interesting. I think about a number of sports. Like association football is the best example, but rugby is another good example. Cricket's another good example. Is that, and it's something that because it goes with the question of why have American sports? Why has baseball and American football not caught on around the world? You could argue that basketball has, but it's been slow. It could have been quicker. And the key difference is that with the British sports, the concept of the foreign tour has always been important. The idea that for your holidays, you will go travel to another country and find people to play your game with.
Jonathan Wilson spoke about it.
Oh, yeah. So right, he talked about the foreign tour. So it's kind of well-known historical fact about all these games is that there have been endless overseas tours that took place, and a lot of these tours went to South America. So by 1900, there had already been professional English teams touring South America to play friendly games, and then it really accelerated from there. And so that's how
it's not part of the empire.
No. But I don't know, you know, that South America was, as historians call South America in that period, the informal empire. So it was not technically under British rule, but British capital was so powerful and British military power was so great They rather like the way that the US projects informal power. There are, you might say that the United States does not have an empire in South America, but it sure has an informal empire in South America. But again, the difference is that the Americans don't make a thing about trying to spread their games. And whereas the British always took their sports with them wherever they went, and that's how they managed to spread them in so many different places. And although, again, it's sort of rather sad thing, a lot of people like to suggest that they're spread by, working class sailors picking up games with the locals. The sad truth is, it's always the aristocrats going to play. It's the elites, and these games spread from the British elites to the South American elites, and then from the South American elites down into the rest of South America.
But basketball came by Protestant missionaries from the US to Liverpool.
Yeah, but again, and basketball. I mean, in some sense, basketball is the one sport that's had some kind of missionary impetus, not just religious, but with YMCA, and that's one of the reasons that it spread in a way that there was never that impetus for baseball, or very limited efforts to try and spread it. And again, the people who control baseball and American football, they're only interested in spreading the game if they will make money out of it. And that's actually not a very good way to sell your game to people. Whereas actually these English gentlemen who were just doing it for, maybe for imperialistic reasons as well, maybe because they thought this was a projection of soft power, but also to some extent just for the fun of it. That's actually a very good way to spread a sport.
Yeah. You were saying that the English were keen to to diffuse their sport around the world. How would you explain the snobism that England had toward FIFA? I mean, in 1904, when FIFA was formed, we had 7 countries, and from what I read or listened from British sport historians, that English did not want really to mingle with the other countries, so they were not really keen to play international football. As a matter of fact, the first time they participated in the World Cup was 1950, and when they got their ass kicked by Hungary, it was a really big wake-up call for them. So I don't know exactly.
Well, so you're right in saying that the people who ran British sports were always snobs. That's certainly true.
I didn't mean to.
No. But I'm not. But you're right. I mean, that's a fair characterization of these people. But on the history, I mean, it's true that the British did not join FIFA in 1904. They joined FIFA in 1905. They then had the president of FIFA was installed. The first was an Englishman. So in that sense, the British involved. There's a long, complicated history about why the British joined FIFA, then they left FIFA, and it had to do with some other issues which are not necessarily about that kind of elitism. I mean, clearly the British always thought, and Brexit today suggests that this is continuing, the British think they're better than anybody else, and they're clearly wrong in this belief. Okay, so there is a problem, but the idea of playing with other people has always been, and they've never been anathema, so they may have been anathema to sharing administration, but they weren't anathema to playing the game. So there were endless tours, and the British had a certain sincerity. They just didn't think before 1950 that they could lose. It turns out they could.
Before 1950, they refused to play the World Cup, to compete in the World Cup.
Yeah, but they didn't refuse to play foreign teams.
Because they think that we create this game are more high level than the other country, maybe the other selections, the other teams.
Right, and until like you said, until the famous game in 1953 against Hungary, where the magnificent Magyars defeat England 6-3 at Wembley.
6-3.
The big reality.
But that's the first time that England loses at Wembley, right?
Very first time.
So England have been playing international football from 1872, and they haven't lost at Wembley until 1953. So there was, and I don't want to exaggerate this, but there was some basis for them thinking that they were above average.
The first lap was 1950 against USA in the World Cup. I
And
think.
the World Cup,
I said at Wembley.
Brazil.
I said lose at Wembley.
Yeah, I know, but the first lap, I mean, they got.
I think they lost in Italy in the 1930s, I think. So they had lost
But
games
it's
in
not
World
an
War.
official, it's a friendly game.
Yeah, but that's the thing that they.
Yeah.
So, but I just want to make this distinction. So I'm not defending
No,
English
What
snobbery.
they
English
did,
snobbery is
what
horrible
they did,
and
yes.
it has a long history and it's
Yes.
terrible. But I just want to draw a distinction between snobbery, which says that it implicitly says I'm just better than you, as opposed to snobbery that says I won't play with you. And the British didn't have that snobbery. They were happy to play with you. They just thought they were better.
It's related to society, yes.
Yeah, it's a kind of.
They
Yeah.
were keen on diffusing football.
They were well. They were so they weren't in a sense. Yeah.
Adding one fixture in the Premier League in the US, if I'm not mistaken, instead of making it 39 on the radio to like 40 or something.
Well, that's about making money now.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think so.
that's less about it. It's just, I mean, the diffusion story is just fascinating because, yeah, I mean, you're right to draw attention to these very elitist, exclusive individuals traveling around the world trying to get other people to play their game. So, but in a sense, again, think about who they played against. They weren't playing against just anybody. They weren't going and saying, oh, pick a group of players from the street. They were playing against the richest people, the most exclusive clubs in Brazil and Argentina, which remember, in 1900, these are some of the richest parts of the world. So it's not like they were really, trying to spread it to everybody. They were trying to spread an elite concept of British gentleman people.
I have a question. So, I mean, just on anecdote, I'm just editing a book, and Nadim Nasser also contributed to it. And I think when we had the workshop where we discussed the chapters, one of the first things we discussed was, should we say in the book soccer or football? So this has become a very serious issue to consistently use one or the other term. We decided to use football. And you said that, criticizing the term soccer is kind of anti-Americanism. And so it seems that like language is also becoming kind of a weapon. And I find it very interesting in rugby. The rugby union, they call the International Federation since 2014 World Rugby. It was before International Rugby Board. And so the International Rugby League Federations, RLIF, the name is less sexy than World Rugby. And of course, World Rugby is giving the impression like the game, that they would have a monopoly on rugby. And so I think this was incredibly smart from Rugby Union to invent this name World Rugby. But it's also kind of insane since there are a number of people playing in the World Rugby League. So language seems to have become a weapon in the world of sports, like for hegemony, for dominance of.
But I mean, this was always true, right? I mean, the way you speak, does have a huge influence on your access to, think of My Fair Lady. That's George Bernard Shaw, right? Written that's for 100 years ago. That was all about how, what he says in the story. He says, speak to me for 10 seconds and I'll tell you where you're born and where you're from and I'll tell you which street you're from. And somehow, the British class system was always very strongly based on how you speak, determining your access to power. And in some ways, in the modern world, that's declined. I mean, again, I don't know how whether this extends to other countries, but I certainly know that in terms of British examples, so I speak the kind of English that people speak in southeast England, which is kind of called received pronunciation, which is sort of proper English, traditionally. Usually, historically, I'm the kind of person who would get to be an announcer on the BBC. If you didn't speak like me, you wouldn't get the chance. That's not true anymore. People with Scottish accents, Welsh accents, Lancashire accents, Yorkshire accents, Geordie accents, they have jobs, even American accents, they have jobs at the BBC now and are allowed to be announced. So in some ways, language barriers, certainly in Britain, have broken down. I don't know if that's, I'd be interested to know if that's true in the rest of the world. But but again, once one kind of barrier is gone, you start to create another, right? You always use it.
I have another question. The subtitle of your book is what the English always lose, German always win, and who's going to win everything in 20 years?
Oh, well, Iraq, I think.
Yeah. Iraq. So this to me is a very English view of soccer, football, because, for instance, the Italian would never say that the Germans always win because they always beat them. The French would always never say that because the English beat the French. Mostly in World Cup. So I wonder, I'm assuming this is economical or another explanation why you have this view that the English always lose, the Germans always win, and in 20 years the Iraqis will win the World Cup. Can you explain where that comes from? Demystifying the subtitle?
Well, the best way to demystify the subtitle is to read the book, though. That's, but I mean, just briefly. So one of the reasons, so Why England Lose is essentially a chapter in that book, and it's part, again, it is addressed to a British audience, or to an English audience specifically, because the English are obsessed with the idea that they don't win enough at football, and that they should win more. And part of that is traumatizing experiences of losing to Germany on many occasions, which they have done. And actually the book is saying, in fact, England does about as well as you'd expect it should do, given its size, population, experience. It's not that bad at all. So in fact, it's actually saying that it's about a misperception of the nature of sporting competition amongst the English. In that sense, but what the other thing that we're focused on, it is true that Germany is amongst the most successful nations in world soccer. And if you take, you're right. I mean, Italy is almost as successful, but not quite. They haven't won as many trophies. And if you add, Germany, Italy, Brazil, you have an overwhelming share of all World Cups ever won, all European championships. Certainly between Germany and Italy. And so it's clear that those nations have been dominant amongst soccer nations for quite a long time. And the interesting question is, what are the causal factors which determine that? And then secondly, what trends are we likely to see in the future? The book has a number of arguments about how economic, social, and cultural factors have determined it. You can agree or disagree, but you would actually have to read the book to see what you thought about that. And then in terms of forecasting, I mean, I think again a lot of it we believe that that economic factors are going to change this, but particularly the growing popularity in the US, growing popularity in countries like China is going to have an impact eventually, but economic effects can take a very long time to work through. And Iraq's just interesting just because. And I think this probably goes for Lebanon too. It certainly goes for Egypt. And actually also in the latest edition we looked at Syria. Football in this part of the world, well, we can argue whether it's number one or number two, but it's a passion amongst millions of people. And this part of the world would produce more great footballers and more great teams were it not for the political divisions. For the politics in this region and the wars have got in the way of developing great teams. And it's reasonable to think that actually, there would have been a world champion coming from this part of the world had this part of the world been politically stable for the last 70 years. And that political instability is what's held back.
It was similar to what Daniel's book, Why Countries Fail, comparing essentially the medal count and why countries don't measure up to their size, their economic power, or why their size in terms of population, why that does not directly translate into gold medal or silver medal or bronze medal counts. And that's why I was interested in why you had that particular subtitle.
Yeah, I mean, you have like countries like Uruguay who do quite well with a small population.
And politically stable. I mean, they don't go to war with anybody. I mean, they have their own internal problems.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think part of it is South America's been relatively peaceful, and I think, I mean, obviously you need to have an interest in the game. But my observation is, and Simon, I mean, I think we both, what we've read and what we understand, it's an obsession in this part of the world, and it's striking that an obsession is not producing more great players, more great teams, and you have to ask why.
But I think it requires to look into this in the case, and particularly in Lebanon, we have discussed this in the Lebanese Sports Scholar Network. Football is becoming a class issue. To enroll in one of the football academies, it costs $100 per month. We are living in a country with a per capita income of $10,000 per year. So there's not much public space where you can play football. So it's not like in other places inclusive. It's not like in other places a tool for social mobility to move up in society. So it's becoming more and more difficult to access like clubs. And this is apart from the lack of political stability, I totally agree, one major issue here.
And I think that, I'm sure that's true, although I would say also, caution also, that is a global trend. I mean, access to sport is becoming more and more exclusive. Access to competitive level and a good level of competition. It's true, I mean, they have this big problem in the United States.
In the US, yes, but like in European countries, you pay $10 per month for a football club.
Again, this is, that's true in Germany. And Germany is a great example. Germany has one of the highest participation rates in the world. And again, that's part of the reason. Why does Germany produce great teams? Well, you've got an infrastructure. It's inclusive. But the UK is not really like that anymore. The UK is becoming increasingly exclusive in terms of access. It's becoming harder and harder. One thing more and more people are privately educated in the UK. So it's now something over 10% of the population is privately educated, and the private schools have wonderful facilities that the parents are paying for, and the state schools have lousy facilities. And it's not surprising when you look at the Olympic medals, a large fraction of Olympic medals are actually coming from students who went to private schools. And so it's becoming a matter of money. And I think, okay, that's not happened in Germany yet, although I hear in Germany now public schools private schools are becoming more popular in Germany. I read recently.
It's still like less than 10%.
Oh no, it's way less than that. But again, I'm talking about trends. As state education systems become more and more run down, we are seeing a trend towards increasing privatization of education opportunities, and that will reduce opportunities for ordinary kids to be successful in sports, as in all aspects of life. And that's a global trend in my view.
I have 2 points. First one about Uruguay. I think Daniel in his book, he talked about early learning, that when a country jumped and scored before the other. I think this was the case of Uruguay. They organized the first World Cup, they didn't have many countries going there, so they had an advantage. They started football before the other. So this explains, I think, why Uruguay still was able to maintain it. It's very popular, they have very good coaches.
It's a past dependency, yeah.
Plus, they play, the South American qualifier is very competitive. They get to play against Brazil twice, against Argentina twice, against Chile twice. So this maintained, I think, their level. That's why they're still very strong countries in football. Concerning England, you were saying that maybe it's more and more expensive to play. I think football as a kid in England. On the other side, in my opinion, I don't know if you, there is much more the elite football system, not the elite people. The elite level athlete in football are increasing. The youth system that the English clubs and the English FA is doing, the youth program is doing, is really much bigger than before. 2017, they won almost all the youth competition, FIFA World Cup, the European, everything. All categories, they won everything, and I think it will start to reflect soon.
They are learning from scratch.
Yeah, and when I was in Neuchâtel in 2002, some people from the FA came, and we didn't take them seriously because they were just lost against Brazil, the quarterfinal 2002, with Ronaldinho was expelled, and Brazil still beat them 2-1. 2-1, I think. And England scored the first goal. So the FIFA students were saying they're not serious. And the FA people told us that they know already who's going to be in the English squad 2014-2015. No one took them seriously. But from what we're seeing now, all these English kids going up in football. So perhaps now it's going more private, but the level of athleticism, the level of the high performance level in England is really going up. Perhaps a less kid playing, maybe I don't know, but the quality of the athletes is going up in all the sports. Maybe I don't know.
So on your first point on Uruguay, I'd caution a little bit about. I mean, your explanation might be right, and I think that's your explanation might be right, but it's hard to explain the pattern of success entirely. I mean, why not Northern Ireland then? Northern Ireland have been playing soccer, football for longer than Uruguay, and yet they're a good team in their history, and they're about the same sort of size of population. So, in that sense, I think, I mean, there are puzzles. I mean, we can't explain everything. I mean, there are, and so I'd be cautious about it. As far as what you're saying about England, well, as an English fan all my life, and inured to the misery of losing various quarterfinals, semi-finals, round of 16, not qualifying, could you imagine, I am just exactly the right age not to be able to remember the 1966 World Cup, but to be able to remember 1970 and every World Cup afterwards, when everything went wrong. So if what you're saying is true, I'm delighted to hear that, and it does seem that the England team is in something of a revival at the moment. But my point would be, I am much more worried about youth, about the general access to football in Britain, which I think is decreasing. And I think, yes, okay, and I think this is true of the Olympics. We focused on elite success, we've been incredibly successful with gold medals, but where we should really be putting our effort financially is actually in general participation in sport, which is much, in my view, is much more important than winning medals or winning trophies, and we don't do enough of that.
I think 90 minutes are over, and I'm glad you reminded me in the last minute of your talk about the 1966 World Cup, since the moderator is from Germany. And I would like to use the extra time to announce that Professor Szymanski is giving this week 2 talks in my political studies classes. Tomorrow, Tuesday, March 12th at 2 p.m. In my US politics class. He will be discussing why Americans invented football. And on Thursday in my comparative politics class at 3:30, he will be discussing why Europeans dominate soccer. Both talks will be in nicely 3-3 and are open to the public. Please join me in thanking Professor Szymanski for his attendance.